it's possible that we just become eradicated as a species. And in my vision, poor governance and government is that nightmare, because the historical trajectory has always been on power and revolutions, violence, bloody revolutions. So having these network states and parallel societies gives us a chance to escape that historical trajectory, almost to leave history in a way. But we have the power now and the ideas to solve these problems. We have the solutions.
Can network states challenge the nation state? What if we could create decentralized, voluntary communities that operate outside of government control? As nation states become more authoritarian, a radical idea is emerging: the network state, a community of people connected online that operates as a digital-first nation with its own economy and governance. But can these actually compete with traditional states, or is this just idealistic theory? To break all of this down, today I'm joined by Sterlin Lujan, a writer, speaker, and philosopher in the fields of decentralization, network states, and alternative political models. Sterlin has worked in the crypto industry for nearly a decade and has written about anarchist political ideas for over 15 years, including his book, Dignity and Decency, Rhapsodic Musings of a Modern Anarchist. In this discussion, we'll explore what exactly is a network state and how does it differ from a traditional nation state. Can network states survive within existing local legal jurisdictions? And the risks of idealism. Do these communities actually work in the real world? Are we witnessing the rise of a new political paradigm as more people look to alternatives to centralized control? Is the network state a real solution or just a utopian experiment? Before we dive in to find out, if you would like to support independent conversations like this, then please do join our Live Free and Prosper membership for just £5 per month to get access to ad-free episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and be part of our online community of free thinkers. Sign up today at danastingregory.com/supporter. You'll find the link in the description. Now, get ready for a deep and thought-provoking discussion with our guest today, Sterlin Lujan.
Sterlin, welcome to the show. Lots of people who follow our work are really interested in learning about how we can approach different ways to navigating society, different structures, parallel systems. Why, in your view, do you think this is an important time in history to be exploring these concepts?
Yeah, Dan, I think for one, I appreciate coming on the show. This is going to be amazing and extremely critical for the current time. So I think one of the things that's going on in the world right now, aside from the corrupt, just insane systems that we're having to deal with right now, there is also what we can refer to as a meta crisis or a meaning crisis. So I always recommend people to look in the work of a guy named John Vervaeke, who did this video series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So why I think this is so relevant, I think that there's a lot of people who are extremely black-pilled, meaning that they suffer from nihilism, depression, and this seeming hopelessness, that they can't find a way forward. They don't know what to do with their lives. And Vervaeke, of course, through his work, says that there's a rise in suicidality rates, a rise in depression, and just an overall feeling of loss and desperation. So what I think one of the things that we're trying to do through this movement is find a way to help people realize that not all is lost, because it's not all about just changing the structures of society. It's also giving people hope that they can realize that change is on the horizon. I always characterize our current situation as a species as being in a kind of birthing crisis, right? An emergency, right? An emergency has there's a couple of perspectives on that word. It's a sense of urgency that something is occurring that needs to be addressed, but it's also emergence, like coming out, like a butterfly erupting from the chrysalis. And so I think that's where we're at. And there's people who've talked about this a lot. For instance, Terence McKenna in his work had this idea that we're in a transitionary period and that we're hurtling to some kind of strange attractor event. He gets a little hardcore with it, but I do think that we're at a bifurcation point or a juncture in time where we have to make some decisions, because we can't keep going down this path that we're on, especially in terms of how we organize, how we cooperate, how we understand our sense-making apparatus as a species, because it's just it's been a repetition of bad after bad after bad, harm after harm after harm, and just a consistent repetition of self-destruction as a society, as a species. But I think now we can actually process a change. There's something else that I'll mention kind of in relationship to this meaning crisis. Along with it, there's also what Daniel Schmachtenberger called the meta crisis, or another term is a polycrisis. All these crises, the idea is that we're beset by all these problems that I think ultimately are structural, but we have potential climatological upheaval, right? Oceanic microplastics, government totalitarianism, democide, which is just governments destroying their own people. There's all these problems that have accumulated, and I think largely that has happened because of the way that we've organized our societies. Our societies are organized in such a way where we can't focus on solving these problems, not truly, because we've created these zero-sum games that we're deeply involved in, meaning everyone's trying to optimize for their own personal well-being, especially politicians, people in positions of power. They're looking to raise their own position, right? Rise in the ranks of the political hierarchy. And what this creates is usually a race to the bottom, or an arms race, right? So these guys they're looking across the sea at other governments, and they're thinking, okay, these guys are developing drone weaponry, drone swarms, biological weaponry, right? Nuclear armaments, just an array of weapons and ideas that make our world worse off, right? And so now they're afraid of being preempted. So now what are they going to do? They're just going to race to build these weapons as quickly as possible and to consolidate their own power. And they do that, of course, while the world seems to burn around us, while these other problems that need to be focused on are not focused down because of these other issues, right? So what this is called in game theory, a lot of different people have talked about this, is a downstream consequence or an externality. So, but very few people have talked about it. They've mostly talked about it in terms of like corporations or companies creating some kind of widget, right? Maximizing profit, and then creating some kind of biohazardous material in a stream. That's a common reference. But in a political context, I think there's more emphasis on the totality of the destruction caused by these zero-sum games, because politics and governments control really the trajectory of history. I don't think a lot of people have really started to conceptualize the harms and the problems that this has caused over the long term. So this is one of the things I think we're trying to address in the Greater Parallel Society movement, which is really adjacent to the cryptocurrency ecosystems as well, which we can, of course, get into. That's, I guess, a good place to start, I think.
Oh, definitely. It sets a context. And before we kind of moved and pivot to talk about some of those potentialities, what, in your view, is the ultimate trajectory of this situation you've outlined? You know, is there a defined endpoint that we could reach if there's not a turning point?
So you mean in terms of if we don't correct this path? Yeah.
Ever growing centralization, you know, well, government, summits, all of these different things, looking at consolidation of power. You know, is that the ultimate endpoint? Is there going to be a greater struggle with these power blocks? Is all of these things going to exacerbate the problem? Where do you see this going if it isn't addressed?
If I may, and I didn't even mention the development of potentially AGI, like artificial general intelligence. That's another thing that's on the horizon, the problems that need focused down. I think what happens ultimately is, so we end up probably, this is the best case scenario, we end up in like an Agenda 2030, one world type of government where everybody is completely controlled, and folks think that this is probably the best idea for maintenance of society. But I think ultimately, if we don't try to solve these individual problems and knock them out one at a time, it's possible that we just become eradicated as a species. And I'm not saying that would happen tomorrow, but I am saying that we have to change our ways. But the beautiful thing is that we have the toolkit, we have the wisdom, we have the knowledge to actually do that now. We have the resources. There's no reason why we can't, but we have to figure out a way to exit the current structure and the current mindset. That's one of the interesting things about game theory and something called Molochian dynamics. And Moloch is the Canaanite god of child sacrifice, or another way to put it is costly sacrifices. So a lot of these people who are in these zero-sum games, if they're not actually dark triad personalities or sociopaths, they realize that what they're doing is horrible, but they feel like they can't escape it, right? And that's the nature of these kind of games. But we have the power now and the ideas and to solve these problems. We have the solutions.
Okay, well, talk to me about some of those solutions then. What is this hope that you're referring to?
Yeah, so one of the things that's happened on a global planetary scale right now is there's a lot of entrepreneurs and visionaries and thinkers who are starting to develop what we refer to as a parallel society. Another term is a network state. And probably before I go off on a monologue about this, we need to really get to an understanding of what these are, so the audience understands it and we're clear. So and I want to also be clear that there's a lot of terminology.
Nice.
So let me just name a few, and I'm not meaning to muddy the waters, just explaining
I'm
this.
glad you're doing this, because even referring to John Vervaeke earlier, like whenever I listen to John, I'm like, I need a glossary of John. And I think someone's actually put together a glossary for John Vervaeke's work, because it introduces a lot of lexicon and jargon. And I think
it does.
That can be a barrier to people, but it also, once you get to grips with that, in the same way with crypto, it actually creates a new world. There's a new world that opens up with this new lexicon that gives us access to deeper meaning. So yeah, please continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vervaeke's work is that's hours and hours and hours and hours worth of video content, starting with ancient Athens, right, all the way up to the modern day, for sure. So currently in the parallel society network state space, there's all these terms, right? Internet native nation, network state, parallel society, autonomous political formation. I could go on and on and on, but let's boil it down. So the term originated, or the term that most people use, is network state, which was coined by Balaji Srinivasan, who is the former CTO of Coinbase. And he wrote a book of the same name called The Network State. And you can go to his website and read it, thenetworkstate.com. And I'm going to use his definition first, and then we can expand a bit. So he defines a network state as an online community that's highly aligned in their values. So it's people who share a common identity, a common culture, and common values. Typically, these communities have started out as crypto communities, where a lot of these guys can have a tendency to be edgelords. They love memes. Oftentimes they're libertarians, right? Yeah. So and this is just one example of a community. So these guys come together online, and because they share values, they have a mutual understanding. It's a form of digital mutual aid, is how I would describe it. And now what Balaji envisions as part of his definition is that these communities eventually want to beam themselves to the ground, right? They want to come together and they want to build a physical community somewhere on the planet, on the earth. And this is, one more part of the definition, and this is something that I don't agree with, but it is part of his definition. He would say that these network states want to grow and become so large that they would want to seek diplomatic recognition from the power players.
Wow.
Right? And they would want to become a power in the world and have their own political and governmental regime. But all the other parts of his definition, I would say we largely agree with, but this idea of diplomatic recognition is just within the purview of his idea of a network state. Now, there are other actors in the world that see this notion of a network state as just a parallel society. Same idea, community that shares values. They come together and they potentially crowdfund territory on the land, but they don't have to do that. They could just maintain a digital presence and have their own governance model. And let me just give an example of how this already kind of works, right? So in the cryptocurrency ecosystem, just a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, a lot of people know about Bitcoin. There's a lot of critiques of Bitcoin, but I want to make a clear point. Regardless of what we think about Bitcoin, it exists in a potentially adversarial environment, and someone can't just shut it down.
Yes.
Right? And it has its own governance, it has its own culture and own people. That is the beginning of a network state in a lot of ways.
A quick break for a word from one of our partners. In times of economic uncertainty, gold has always been used as a safe haven for wealth. It's a tangible asset that has historically held its value, even when markets were volatile. And now more than ever, it's crucial to have physical assets that can protect your wealth. That's why we've partnered with the Pure Gold Company. They offer a secure, reliable way to buy physical gold bullion and precious metals, whether you're looking to diversify your portfolio, hedge against inflation, or simply protect your savings. With fully insured gold products stored in world-class private vaults, you can rest assured that your physical gold is safe and secure. For bullion-grade gold bars and coins, the Pure Gold Company makes it easy to purchase physical gold that you can actually hold. If you're ready to take action and safeguard your wealth, then visit danastingregory.com/gold to download your free guide and take advantage of a free consultation to explore your gold bullion options. Now, let's get back to the show.
Now, the pinnacle or the zenith of a network state is the idea that we have a full governance model, like what has been, I want to try not to get too technical here, but what has been called a decentralized autonomous organization.
Yes.
Where people are all together in a community in cyberspace, but now maybe they have a governance structure in place where they have a rulemaking apparatus. Maybe they have a treasury and they have a token, and now they can use their rulemaking and their sense making to deploy that capital for the creation of or the maintenance of some type of end goal, right?
In the physical realm or the digital realm?
It could be either or.
Yes.
Right. So if they wanted to put this money to building something in a physical structure, they could do that. Or if they just or if they're wanting to promote something in the digital realm with this funding, they could. Like they wanted to use their treasury to build a software or allocate funds like a venture capital firm, they could do that. And those actually exist right now, right? Yeah. Or they could build physical structures, purchase land. You see where we're getting somewhere, right? Because these governance structures are not also easy to shut down, right? They have anti-fragility. You can't just go up and press a button and they're gone. The key point here with a network state or a parallel society is that these folks eventually want to secure land. And just a point of this, most of the times, and we can get into the fact that these actually exist and they're all over the place now, but a big point is that they go typically to places like special economic zones or what's called a special financial zone, where they get special privileges from a host government. Usually they get a lot of sovereignty and autonomy to do whatever they want and to experiment with what they want, because a lot of governments in the world, and there's a point behind this, they don't want to be beholden to the Western world. They don't want to have to deal with the hegemony of the U.S.'s control over the fiat currency with the U.S. dollar. So they're open to having all these guys.
They're experiencing the same problems.
Right. That's right. They're
state level.
That's right. At very much. So, and these special economic zones are everywhere. Just to name one territory. So just outside of Dubai, there's a ton of special economic zones that just dot the territories. And the purpose is to create economic incentives to build out the communities in these areas, which also in theory would help Dubai grow as well, which is one of the reasons it's kind of like a smart city that has. Singapore is also a bit of an example, but that's the point. There's a lot of these communities that are growing up in these special economic zones around the world. Now I'm happy to talk about those more unless you have other questions, but this is where we're at. And this is kind of the definition of
I kind of want to pick up on some of the potential objections. So what would you say to someone to say, well, why does this have to be digital? Why can't it be old school pen and paper, ledger, agreements between individuals? What problem does this solve that cannot be solved in the kind of offline physical realm?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I would say first, and this is a bit of a caveat, it could either be technically could either be high tech or low tech.
Uh-huh.
It's just the only problem with that is that these communities often form online first, and that have just traditionally been part of the crypto community, which is often high tech, like cypherpunk, crypto anarchist type of community.
It has their mindset,
That's right,
and they're geographically disparate. They're not necessarily concentrated at the point of origin.
That's right. But ironically, a lot of people who have gotten into cryptocurrency have been people for a lot of really early adopters, and a lot of crypto activity has happened in third world countries, which would seem really destitute. Like there's a huge cryptocurrency economy in Africa, in some of the most remote areas of Latin America where people are just trading crypto. They have mining usually because they can now access different types of a lot of them use Starlink, right? They're out, but they have access to internet, typically some type of service. And so they get into crypto because they don't trust the local government's currencies or monies. And then this naturally leads people to start thinking about building their own communities, which naturally it kind of coheres.
But it makes sense because even just on pure economics, a lot of these territories, South America, Africa, they've experienced hyperinflation and they've seen the value of their money erode. So even if you're just looking at pure capital and looking at economics, the incentive is to escape that structure.
That's right. And I want to make a key difference between, say, a network state and an intentional community. So an intentional community doesn't, the key difference is they don't always have to cohere online first. A lot of times intentional communities are just people in a local region or territory that have come together and decided they wanted to start their own intentional community. An intentional community can also have some people online, but the big differentiating factor is that most of these people with a network state form online, and a lot of times they have probably more capital because they're into crypto, and they also have a vision for making this very, very large so that they can. And here's the thing: Balaji in his book talks about this idea of a one commandment. So usually they have a certain guiding principle or goal that they align on, and they build these communities around that goal to solve that particular problem. I think this is an important point. I go back a little bit to this idea of a meta crisis. Like, right, we have all these problems that we're trying to solve, or that we really desperately need to solve around the world. So one of the things that network state inspires is if they're focusing on a one commandment, they can tackle these problems, you see, one at a time. Just an example. So Prospera is a network state startup society. That's another term for it, by the way, in Honduras. That's active right now on the ground. I'm actually going there right after this event to speak at a conference. But those guys have a targeted focus on biotech and human longevity, and they're trying to solve that problem. All the startups that they found under the aegis of Prospera are focused on human longevity, pushing forward biotech, and trying to figure out ways to solve this particular problem.
I just want to address the alarm that's probably going off in some people's head at the moment when you're saying the
transhumanism.
Yes, I mean, I do want to make sure we can compartmentalize that so we can understand the concept, even if there's concern around the application of that particular project, because that's just one example you've given.
Yes.
But do you want to?
Yeah. So
what's that?
Just briefly and tangentially, I understand that a lot of people have concerns, especially in our community, about transhumanism, but I think a lot of people haven't really dug into it, because I think a lot of our focus is on what we would refer to as political transhumanism. Of
course,
where these technocrats are trying to force people to, like Elon's potential Neuralink brain chip, right? And then of course the altering DNA via vaccines and other types of gene therapies and things like that.
Yeah, I said, can I just chime in? So
Sure.
There's around some of these technologies. Let's think about, you're wearing glasses, right? So technology to enable human well-being and longevity has existed for a long time. There's a lot of things we've been able to do, bionic arms, people who've lost their life, there's lots of technologies that can certainly aid humanity. But I can also see that almost dystopian or political transhumanism. But let's not get drawn too much into the tangent. I just wanted to address it because I knew the alarm would be going up.
No worries. And I just finish a brief point like that. So I just recommend everyone look into the different areas of transhumanism. There's a field called extropianism, which is a field invented by a guy named Max Moore, who focuses not only on the longevity piece, but also has an evolving rational framework for human freedom that is built into this. So there's a lot of different ideas here.
For nuance.
Yeah. So yes, I just mean to bring up a point here that these guys have that one commandment that Balaji talked about, which I agree with. So credit where credit's due to Balaji. I don't agree with all of his ideas, but he's put his money where his mouth is, and he wants to push this forward. where that goes is another question, but there's a lot of these communities, and this is Prospera is one of them, and they're targeting this idea because they see there's a lot of positive momentum in the biotech space for actually helping humanity. And that's their belief, and that's what they're doing, right? But the point is that, okay, if somebody's terrified of the problem of oceanic plastics and microplastics and what Timothy Morton called a hyperobject, right? This object, the ocean, that we can't really understand, and we only can view it through the lens of our mortal lives in the moment that we're in, when this thing is like, it's expansive, it's universal, it's everywhere. So one of these communities would need to get together and just target down the problem of oceanic plastics. And here's the key thing. We'll go back to this topic because game theory is very important in this. So if we create these communities where people can move into and they can work on this different problem, and those communities also have low exit and switching costs, so people who don't agree with the rules there can leave and go to these other communities. This creates a scenario where it's very difficult for those communities to corrupt and to enter into zero-sum games, so that they can stay very specifically targeted on this problem to solve it. You can see how this network state idea starts working on a solution set for the meta crisis. It's not just about destroying these social structures that have undermined us. There's a lot more of an expansive way that we can heal ourselves as a species through the process of building these network states and parallel societies, because it minimizes these Molochian dynamics to such a strong degree. And there needs to be more research on this for sure, but I strongly believe this is a path forward. At least it gives us an out.
So can you help me understand a little bit? So the term network state to me almost implies, if you think about physical state, there's so many nuances and complexities within a state, that affects every area of our life. The way you've described this kind of output with a singular focus feels like a very entrepreneurial focus with a specific problem. How does that then translate into differing models of living, for instance? How can a network state potentially replace a physical state? Could it eventually become so prevalent that it could actually usurp the local laws and jurisdictions that it resides within?
Yeah, and to address the first question, so not all of these network states or parallel societies have to necessarily use Balaji's model of the one commandment. That's just one version that's already taking shape. It also, communities who just want to exit the systems that haven't served us and just live with people who share their values is a really important part of this. But even those communities a lot of times have it's not all about exiting the system. Also, they have goals and ambitions and things they want to do with their lives. So this movement supports that as well. And depending on their goals, that likely supports our greater vision as well. Because a lot of these people are into things like permaculture, a lot of what we talk about here. So this is all about sustainability and helping the planet in the long term also.
Presumably in the way you've described these special economic zones, these even though they're digital, they're still originated from a physical location. So
yes,
you might be using all kinds of technology to kind of mask where you're actually operating from, but presumably there is actually a physical point of origin for many of these network states, and they're still subject to some sort of local authority, even if it's minimized compared to, say, the United Kingdom or United States.
Yeah, so let's first, I want to talk about a very important idea. I talked about this during my talk. This is a long and important discussion. So I mentioned Balaji and network state, but that's not the genesis of the idea. The idea was originally created and dreamt up by the cypherpunks in the 1990s. So a lot of people are familiar with Timothy May, who wrote the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto. He also wrote a piece that is really obscure and most people aren't familiar with, and I think is even more valuable than the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto.
What's the cypherpunk before you continue?
Oh, yeah, no worries. So a cypherpunk is just a person who believes in writing code and leveraging strong encryption technologies, things like pretty good privacy, zero knowledge cryptography. We won't go too crazy. We won't too crazy. But basically a coder, a hacker, who wants to use code to insulate themselves from systems that try to hurt them. Yeah, that's right. No, anti-surveillance, pro-civil liberties type of folks, right? So they're people who are seeking to improve and benefit society by stopping what David Chom, who is a cypherpunk, called the creation of a dossier society, where governments have a dossier on every single person. So These are the guys who originally envisioned this network state idea. And you could see clearly why they would do that, because they were creating these communities in the cloud already that cohere around cypherpunkism and crypto-anarchism. So the piece that Timothy May wrote is called Libertaria in Cyberspace. Same idea, network state. He envisioned it as strictly being in cyberspace when he first wrote about the idea in 1992. But their whole modus operandi was that these communities would grow in cyberspace, their governance models would accumulate, and these would be a power center in and of themselves that would diminish the power of the nation state over time, because they would do. This was before tokenization, this was before governance and DAOs, but they would eventually gain so much power that it would start usurping power from the nation. Now let's get into this a bit more with this idea of how is this actually going to impact the current system. So I wrote an article on my blog. My blog's called Counter Governance, and the idea behind counter governance, and this is a directly in relationship to Samuel Edward Conklin III's work, where he had counter economics, where we're doing economic transactions in a circular economy to subvert the state, right? Very, very clear. I think a lot of people have heard of Samuel Edward Conklin III. Derek's talked about him a whole lot. He's got amazing books. So counter governance stems from that. And the idea is now that we create a governance apparatus that people voluntarily opt into, right? The crypto-anarchist idea, libertarian cyberspace, network states, that starts to incrementally usurp power from the government. So and the nation state. So we have multiple avenues for attacking the state in this way, right? With counter governance, counter economics, and network states are just the continuation of this process. But the thing is, it is gradual, it is over time. And let me get a bit deeper into how this process kind of works, right? When was this article? Maybe 92 as well, 93. A guy named Trent McDonald wrote a piece called The Unbundled State. And what he envisioned was that all the services that the state offers, right? Of course, the state coerces people to use its services, which the most obvious ones are things like security, courts, police, etc. Those are just coerced services. So in this idea of the unbundled state, you unbundle all those different services and you offer them on the free market. Now imagine a scenario where everyone around the world has these, no matter where they're at, especially if they're network states and they're boots on the ground, and they opt into these services, right? What this does over time, people are opting into these services all around the world. This is forcing nation states to become a market actor rather than a coercive regime, because people are opting into those services. And if people realize and know they can do that, they start to leave the nation state and this is something we already see, especially after the COVID pandemic, right?
Yes.
Everyone left their jobs because they had to work from home remotely, and then they realized, fuck that. Why am I going back to work?
Yeah.
Right? And this is what's been referred to as the Great Resignation. People left their work, especially in the financial sector. There's all kinds of statistics out there. People can look into this. And they became digital nomads. A lot of time they traveled around the world, everywhere. And this has just been part of this idea. It's contributed to the idea of network states, because a lot of these people becoming digital nomads have also become interested in intentional communities and network states and all the different variations thereof. But I see the vision like this. Over time, the state becomes increasingly unbundled, a la Trent McDonald. And then it just, over time, loses its power to the point of where it has to become a market actor. So, and yes, to your point directly, right now, through special economic zones, a lot of these network states are beholden to the local nations. But I think my point from earlier still stands, where it's the right time, because all of these third world countries are loosening up a lot more on this idea, because they are incentivized to try to grow their own economies and crawl out of the hellhole, the financial hellhole that they're embedded in. So I think this is a huge opportunity that we have right now to change the course. And I mentioned in my talk this writer, right, James Joyce, who wrote, the most popular piece was Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, as a stream of consciousness. But he said history is a nightmare from which we are trying to awaken, right? And in my vision, poor governance and government is that nightmare, because the historical trajectory has always been on power and revolutions, violence, bloody revolutions, and everyone trying to just engage within this dynamic, and that usually calls for violence. So having these network states and parallel societies gives us a chance to escape that historical trajectory, almost to leave history in a way. We can get deeper into this, but I think what could potentially happen is, because we have all these network states that exist, now we have an opportunity to actually run experiments in governance and understand what keeps people happy, what prevents those zero-sum games, those corruption dynamics, and what simultaneously creates more growth while people stay happy. And so in a way, we're able to predict well into the future how a civilization will iron itself out. Right? Everyone called democracy this great experiment when it was re-envisioned and it resurged in the Enlightenment, especially in the US. But then it was just copied and pasted around the world when, as everyone was quote unquote overthrowing these monarchies, they could have implemented a different government or governance style and experimented with it, but they didn't. It was just democracy. And I think a lot of us realize that democracy hasn't actually worked, right? That's because it wasn't an experiment. It was just some ruling class or ruling elite who made an ad hoc determination on what would work for society. Yeah, sure, they used the vision, the original democratic vision that was dreamt up in ancient Athens, but it ended up not working. The point is, now we can actually test a hypothesis around governance and build frameworks that allow us to solve our most fundamental and pressing problems around governance, especially to minimize corruption, violence, and the brutishness that have come with our current historical trajectory. And I think it's a beautiful time. The opportunity is amazing, because I can't think of anything greater to do than to deeply understand our human dynamics, our human cooperation and sense-making styles. Because if we do that, then we render the future more known, more understandable, more approachable. And right now it just feels like chaos, right? Even within the context of chaos, there's some, I think it's what Stephen Wolfram called a rulead. There's some like simple rule at the bottom that drives it all. So imagine being able to understand that and to some degree predict our future. Now the futures that this presages can be scary for a lot of people, but I think it's just better than continuously self-cannibalizing, destroying ourselves. So
well, on that point, you've led to a different train of thought for me, because I think as people are watching or listening, I think people will be calculating in their mind. I'm not sure, trying to weigh up, is this actually a utopian vision of tomorrow or a dystopian vision? Because in a way, I know some people will be thinking, well, this just sounds like this giant metaverse where we're replicating the real world in the digital world, but trying to optimize for a different way of existing. I don't want to live in the digital world. I want to live here and now. So how do we address that point of the fine balance between utopia and dystopia, and with that, in a way, address the potential reality of the emergence of technocracy in this new world, this idea that the expert class, this new digital class, have a better vision for society than the past? How does that manifest? And then the other side of it is addressing the potentiality for dark triads again, because in the creative space, there again, there's the old adage that there's a fine line between genius and madness, and that madness line is where the sociopathy comes from. It's where those dark triads can be found in many of those great entrepreneurial thinkers. So is there a risk that these points can be transmuted into this new network state model?
Yeah, that's a good point, because I agree with you that we definitely don't want to go down a route of a dystopia, and we don't want this to transition into that one world government somehow accidentally or coincidentally. So one of the things I mentioned earlier, and I kind of just glossed over it, but I think it's fundamental and central. It's like a chief concern of what we're talking about, this idea of, so a myriad of different network states and parallel societies. That the idea is that, and I didn't want to provide an emphasis that all of these societies are ultimately accepting the same governance models. Different people have different ideas, different philosophies. Some people prefer to have their lives micromanaged from cradle to grave. Fine, if they want to do that, they can build a society around that. But I would say most people in our communities too want societies that are more free and liberated. And so there's room for all of these ideas. But I think the key point that we have to be able to solidify and concretize is this idea that exit and switching costs have to be kept extremely low in these communities. And that's because if you don't do that, then it has a potential to corrupt. It goes a really horrible direction. And
so, for example, if you find yourself, let's take it back to the physical realm, you're under a tyrannical regime or dictatorship, or even during the COVID chapter, some of the most developed, seemingly liberal countries in the world became some of the most authoritarian and tyrannical. The cost of then moving out of that space, leaving your worldly belongings behind in a way, your connections, there's a great cost to that transition. And I know many people have made that transition, meeting people here in Mexico who have, moved to Mexico in different parts of the world to escape that kind of cultural totalitarianism. So I wanted to give an illustration that, in this network state space that becomes a parallel. So, okay, if you're in this community and you find actually this doesn't fit, the ability to transition just to another needs to be simple and as cost effective as possible.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because if the switching costs are kept low, what that ultimately does too is it dissuades tyrannical personalities from doing their thing, right? Because everyone's just going to leave and go to societies that are more amenable to their particular philosophies. So it puts the brakes on dark triad personalities quite significantly. But now, of course, there's questions that arise like, how do you enforce those switching and exit costs? And I don't think we can go down this rabbit hole because it's a long way. But I do think there's got to be there's institutions, there's technical solutions, it's all about incentives and game theory. There's ways to do this, leveraging our institutions and our technologies that will prevent that. But we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. Point is, if exit and switching costs are kept low, it will really prevent this totalitarian growth and this direction that we've gone into. I really want to emphasize that these communities can really be anything that they want. And what I'm promoting personally is a more cosmopolitan society, a heterogeneous society, a society of great plurality and differences, because it's really a recognition that we are all different and we have different understandings. One of the huge problems of our modern world is we're all embedded in this constant politicking. Politicians and kleptocrats and these dark triad personalities effectively decide our thinking for us a lot of times, right? But most people are in the box of left or right. And that's where their thought is. It's a warping of the psychology. It's what Just Mirlo called the rape of the mind. And so having these myriad of different societies allows people to become more open to different ideas and different philosophies. I don't even think there's a necessity of being a fight between, say, socialism and capitalism. I think those ideas interpenetrate on a large level in an environment where innovation and experimentation and novel governance models run rampant. So I don't even necessarily call myself an anarchist as much as I do now a panarchist or a cosmopolitan, right? Because this is the ultimate vision, is that we escape the illusion or the red herring of having to politic and fight with each other. I talked about this in my talk. I get really riled up about this, but imagine how much human energy and time and glucose is spent on politic and getting some guy elected to coerce everyone else for your own values. That is part of that Molochian dynamic. And stopping that puts us one foot forward into a brighter, better future. I mean, because what the ultimate goal of all of this is to create human flourishing and the ability to thrive, and this idea that Schmachtenberger has of collective betterment. Right now we're in a situation where, so there's this idea that they talk about naive progress, right, versus authentic progress. Under the rubric of naive progress, we're pushing forward. We're building all these technologies. We're doing all this stuff. We have all these governments and all these bright ideas, and people call this progress. But if we're creating those externalities and those downstream harms that I talked about earlier, is that actual progress? Actual progress includes existential risk management. It includes an understanding of human dynamics and game theory. It understands the idea of restraint and wisdom and governance and organizing. So this is a big component of how we're pushing forward. But yes, like to put a cap on that, I would definitely. I'm not promoting, and I don't think most people in our space, not all, are promoting a technocratic society. We want a heterogeneous society. We want a society of multiple different communities. The research that I'm talking about, that preferable future aim, is going to be different. It doesn't necessarily have to be a monoculture. It can be a multitude of different cultures, because these different societies or communities can select governance models that could be completely different, but that have shown to work to some degree, and that meets their personal needs.
I think that's fascinating. I mean, that's a whole subject in itself, as we've been discussing this idea of and another risk factor is a potential monoculture. You know, when we think of monoculture and monocrops, we think about like singular types of crops in a field. When people are gathering around values, for instance, it's not necessarily replicable in the physical realm again. So where I live in my hometown, there's a rich multitude of perspectives, ideas. You know, we haven't purposefully gathered. Some may say there's an absence there for you. And I find my tribe locally within the context of a wider culture. But where I live physically isn't dominated by that value set. I could extrapolate that further, and you say if I'd chosen to live in Great Britain because of its culture, if it has one now, there is no. I wouldn't say there's a definable culture I could put my hand on, but historically there was a view of what Britain represented. Similarly, in the United States, the American dream, people connected with the overall idea of a state level culture in a way. If a country had cultivated a set of values and principles that it could communicate to the global marketplace, but my concern, if you pull that out, and it's lovely coming to a community space. We're both at the People's Reset and Morelia as we're recording this. You come across like minds and like values, but actually there is still a great deal of differences. If you actually were to spend the time to look for differences, you'd find plenty. But I do wonder if there's a risk factor of this idea of just coming around together of a monoculture in the digital realm or even the physical realm, that whether that comes with its own set of risks.
Yeah, it certainly does. But one of the cool things that we've seen just in the cryptocurrency ecosystem in a very real way, all these people are producing these meme coins, right? And all these shit coins. And they all have their own unique kind of cultures, and they share the same memetics and the same ideas. And these have just proliferated. They're just everywhere. So I think there is some evidence, at least in the crypto community, that people are starting to think in these like tribal communities in their own defined, unique ways that are clearly differentiated from the rest of the communities. So this is what we call, crypto tribalism as well. And tribalism isn't always a good thing, but something that is good is having that multifarious culture that exists.
Yes.
I think that's pretty
tribalism.
cool.
I mean, the idea of tribe is deeply embedded in our history, and again, there's parts there we can look at some of the things we may want to leave to history, and there's other parts we want to carry forward. We're coming up to the kind of time on this one. I want to kind of bring it back to physicality and practicality.
Yeah, let's do that.
So how do we translate this network state idea and the way it's described back to this? Let's recap how we bring that back to the physical realm, and then talk about how people, if they're interested in finding out more, as we can step into this realm.
Yeah, this is really important, because I know we talk about pretty abstract ideas when we discuss the future of this stuff, but network states are proliferating. They're everywhere right now. This is a huge movement. So I'll just maybe name a few, and then people can just look into them, right? And we can provide like a link, a QR code after he's on the show. So, okay, so Balaji, who I mentioned a lot, he has his network school that actually physically exists in Malaysia. I was there personally. I went at the end of October, spent 2 months there. It's a community that's growing out. It has its ups and its downs. I don't agree with everything that, I'm not going to sit here and trash Balaji, but I don't agree with everything that he did. But the fact is he's doing it, right? He exited, he's got his community together, network state started in the cloud, has ideas of how to run it. People met. He just opened up applications for Pop-Up City Network School number 2.
Wow.
So you can actually go to the network school, apply for it, and you can go there. And Here's the thing. A lot of people are like, well, is this just for billionaires who are going to hobnob on an island together taking MDMA or whatever? Not necessarily. It was actually,
I hope not.
yeah.
Again, it's repeating old patterns.
That's right. So he kept prices incredibly low.
Yeah.
The hotel was super cheap. You had to, of course, get the ticket to get over there.
Yeah.
But it was fairly inexpensive. I want to say it was like maybe $2,000 a month or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
He didn't have any overhead costs. He just basically, that was the hotel payment. And then they even provided food. You had to pay for your own food, of course, but it's not like, okay, pay, $10,000 and then you can come. So, and then of course I mentioned Prospera. That's a particular focus. That one is a bit more high end. You have to have because they're looking for entrepreneurs to come, and that's understandable. Also, one that I'm particularly fond of is Vitalik Buterin, the creator of Ethereum, started what's called Zuzalu. Zuzalu is a series of pop-up cities called Zoo Villages. And there's actually one that's going to happen in Switzerland in April. I'm going to be in Europe, so my intention is to go there and visit their pop-up city. They've had one in Montenegro, one in Georgia, there's one in Africa. So these are physical communities people can go to and live in and be. And these guys have documents on governance and how to cooperate. It's really crypto-anarchic. So these communities are emerging in parallel right now. I'll also mention this. These guys don't have a physical community yet, but Praxis Nation just got, I think, a $525 million capital injection. So if this tells you how serious people are about building these out, that should be a very strong indicator of where we're going with these communities. People are serious about creating these. And the other thing that I'll mention is, remember, these start digitally first. If you want to get an idea of how these communities work, what kind of people are involved, all of these communities, and this will be on the spreadsheet that I give you, have usually a Discord community or some other kind of community where you can meet and you can chat, you can get ideas and the rules and the values and all the documentation. And you can do that. Anybody can do that right now to get involved in these communities, right? So yeah, this is widespread. A lot of ideas we're talking about are philosophical and future-oriented, and there's some critical theory in there. But I think if you just look at the communities right now and you see what they're doing, it'll be like an aha moment, like an epiphany, right? And you can just go to them and visit them if you're interested in that. If you're not, there's still what Derek's doing is also growing tremendously. You got the Conscious Agora. There's all these intentional communities. So whatever your flavor, that's the point. They're out there, right? This is, again,
completely, there's the completely digital free option. There's plenty of people building that, but there's also the digital first version. And I think that's the most important thing, is it comes back to that principle of choice, voluntarism. You're non-coerced. It's optional. You can go experience these things.
Yep, that's true. It's practical, it's pragmatic, it's real, it's happening. And I of course I've theorized on the future and how we can grow this out, but yeah, we can do it right now. You can go and you can live in these places. I did it.
Yes. Well, it's fascinating to be with you here today. There's so much we can explore. Let me know in the comments, having watched this through, whether you're inspired or petrified by what we've just discussed. We talked about the kind of digital element of it and the technology, and I think that can be intimidating for some. We've worked with a lot of people in the crypto space over the last couple of years and navigating the jargon, the lexicon, the tools. But like many things, once you get that baseline understanding of how to navigate the space, you find that the map of the territory starts to expand. So there are great people like Sterlin and others who can help us navigate this emerging concept of the network state, this parallel polis. So let me know in the comments if you'd like to hear more about this and expand on this. And maybe we could host some workshops to bring together some deeper understandings of some of the things that are possible. Sterlin's going to provide us a link to some of those digital communities that you can go and investigate and check out for yourselves. But I'm really just curious in your thinking. So a shout out for me before I hand back to Sterling. If you like these types of conversations, please do make sure you subscribe. You can find us on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, Spotify, Apple. If you like to listen on the move, do go check us out on the audio platforms. If you'd like to go a little deeper and support what we're doing, we've got the Live Free and Prosper community, which you can find at Astin-Gregory.com/supporter. You can get early access to all of our conversations, be part of our community, at the forefront of these different discussions. And for Sterling, you're involved in a project called Logos, and there's other things. You've got your Substack. Could you just give people a primer on where people can find your work?
Yeah. So you can find my personal work on Substack at Counter Governance, and also Deep Governance Research is part of an organization I started called Polis Laboratories, right? And then You can go to logos.co. Logos is developing infrastructure for network states and parallel societies. So check them out. We'll have a link too.
Yes, there's a manifesto to read there as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the manifesto is amazing. I really recommend the logos.co manifesto to understand what we're doing at Logos and with the greater ecosystem. I also have my first book with me right here, Dignity and Decency. You can find this on Amazon. If I understand people don't like buying stuff on Amazon, reach out to me personally and I'll get you a copy. So I'm working on my second book, which will contain more of the ideas we talked about today. But this is like base level understanding of what we're doing. So highly recommended.
Thank you, Sterlin. It's been a privilege being with you here today. Really
Thanks,
enjoyed
brother.
the conversation.
Appreciate it.
Really good. And sparked so many ideas. There's so many more questions. But again, thanks very much for being with us, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. And we'll see you again very soon on the Astin-Gregory podcast.
Cheers.
Before we sign off, if you got value from this episode, don't let the conversation stop here. Join us inside the Live Free and Prosper online community for exclusive content, guest Q&As, and a private space for free thinkers just like us. It's just £5 a month, and by becoming a member, you help us to beat the censors. Join us now at danastingregory.com/supporter or click the link in the description. I'll see you inside. The idea of network states challenges everything we know about governance, sovereignty, and community. But can they truly compete with nation states, or are they destined to remain a niche or even utopian experiment? As we've explored today, the fight for decentralization and voluntary systems is just beginning. Whether these ideas succeed depends on how we build, innovate, and take action in the real world. This conversation does not end here. If you're interested in decentralization and creating new systems for human freedom, then please join our online community where we continue these discussions with like-minded free thinkers. Head over to danastingregory.com/supporter to get immediate access to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and direct discussions with our guests. Plus, you'll get access to all of my personal notes from the People's Reset Mexico, where this episode was recorded, including Sterlin's keynote and behind-the-scenes footage from his side event with the Logos community. Sign up right now at danastingregory.com/supporter. We really can't do this without you. If you enjoyed this episode, then hit the like button, subscribe, and do share it with someone who needs to hear this. The future isn't just something we react to, it's something that we create and build. So come and join our community of free thinkers and be part of the future you want to create. Thanks for tuning in to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast. We'll see you in the next episode. Until next time, live free and prosper.